Now, this is a slide that shows the attack on the Pequot fort. Now, most people know the Pequots now as the people who started one of the first casinos in Connecticut. But in 1637, which was only 1 year after Springfield was founded, there was a Pequot War broke out, and as a nation, the Pequots were nearly annihilated. The surviving Pequots were put on a boat and were actually brought to the Caribbean.
Right.
And
Nassau and other islands, and put into slavery.
And the boat that brought them there was called the Desire. And the boat came back with a boatload of African slaves. There was the first slaves that were brought to the New World, and they landed in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts was actually the first colony that basically allowed slavery.
So one of the things we try to do in this book is we wanted to chart the origins of the African American community, and of course, people who are not as familiar with our area think of slavery as a Southern institution, but we wanted to point out that it was very much in New England as early as the 1650s, and in the book we describe those early evidences of it and how it interconnected with Springfield as the early settlement, including the leaders of the community, like the Pynchons, the Chapins, and the Coltons, who owned slaves to help carve out this part of the wilderness. So African Americans have been part of this community from the very, very beginning, and we wanted to point that out in this history.
Now this next slide, it shows the Boston Massacre, and one of the first people to die at the Boston Massacre was an African American named Crispus Attucks. Now, this was 5 years before the Revolution actually started. There's a famous, a little bit more crude drawing of this that's done by Paul Revere, but it showed, and he was actually worked on a ship, and it showed basically that right from the beginning, in what's considered one of the first acts of rebellion against the British, one of the first casualties was an African American.
And by this time, there was not only there was a African Americans still in slavery in Massachusetts, but there were also free African Americans in the communities throughout Massachusetts. And in fact, next slide. Well, this is Bunker Hill, and again, if you look far to the right, you'll see one of the patriots is an African American in back of the fellow with the sword. You see that far to the right. That they were part of the freeing the colonies from British rule. Here you have Agrippa Hull to the left, and he fought through most of the war. What was it was the first battle he was in? Might have been.
We was at Saratoga.
Saratoga, and he was there right till Yorktown. And so, here's an individual who didn't simply, show up for one battle and go back to farming. He was there for the duration. To the right is Lemuel Haynes, and he's out of Granville. He ultimately became the first African American congregational minister in history. And he came out of there. But at the time of the Revolution, he joined his fellow freemen as a Minuteman to respond to the Lexington and Concord alarm. And so he was one of the fellows who picked up the rifle and powder and headed out to Eastern Mass to confront the British. So here again, many times in the early histories, you don't hear about Black Americans fighting in the Revolution, but yes, they were very much part of that, even from the very early days. Now, by the end of the war, as the war dragged on in the North, in particular, as the South, because the war moved south and ended in Yorktown, many of the regiments started to fill out with African Americans who were offered freedom in some cases if they were slaves or if they were freemen to fill out the regiments. And the British noted at the end of the war that there were a lot of African Americans with arms in the American forces. And they could see which way things were going. In fact, when Baroness von Riedesel, who was with the troops that were captured at Saratoga, was traveling through Western Mass, they passed through Westfield, and she remarked on how many black Americans she saw in the community in Westfield, but also in uniform with arms. So it's important to keep that in mind.
And the other side of the story there too, because remember the winners get to tell the story, and the America was the winners. But actually, far more African Americans fought on the side of the British,
right? Because
they were immediately told that they would be given their freedom.
Right, and you don't hear too much about that either. And in fact, later on in the War of 1812, they call the Black Marines of the British Navy really kept Virginia pretty much occupied while the British burned Washington, because they were afraid of these free black troops from the British Army inciting a revolt in Virginia. So it's an interesting aspect of the new research now is showing how much of an impact that had on freezing where the American troops were positioned. And again, after the Revolution and the Constitution, it allowed slavery to continue. And so therefore, there was a lot of hesitance to have any black Americans, certainly in Maryland and South, to be carrying weapons. Now, so it really debilitated our ability in the War of 1812 to defend ourselves, because we cut that part of our population out of the defense of America.
Now, if you cut back to after the Revolution, when we had these phrases like "all men are created equal," in Massachusetts in particular, people began to wonder about slavery, and there began a movement to end slavery. And these are two people here that were very instrumental in that.
Right. I mean, in 1780, remember, the war wasn't ended until 1783, but in 1780, Massachusetts crafted a new constitution, and with the idea that what they were fighting for needed to be at a higher plane, and in the Constitution, it essentially outlawed slavery in Massachusetts. Now, that being said, people who owned slaves, some of them wanted to ignore that, especially out in Western Mass, and it took several court cases in the mid-1780s before that constitutional right was afforded. But then after that, we became a haven for people to escape slavery, come to Massachusetts after that period. Now, also, in the middle of the 1780s, another thing happened that was very, very important and led to the crafting of the U.S. Constitution in 1789, and that was Shays' Rebellion. And it was during that period, and this is where you can talk about Mumbet and so forth.
Yeah. Now, the people here, this is Mumbet Freeman on the left and Theodore Sedgwick on the right. Sedgwick at one point was a slave owner, but he decided to free his slaves, and he basically was the one who started the ball rolling against slavery. Now, this is a drawing that was done in the very, very early 1900s to illustrate one of the most, it really took place in 1808, and this is the story of Jenny, who was an escaped slave. She escaped actually and moved to Springfield in 1800, got married in the church, which is in Springfield at the Congregational Church, had children, and then 8 years later, a man shows up from New York. His name was Van Geyserling. He was from Schenectady, New York. And he claimed that she was an escaped slave, which she was. He had the right to take her back, even though slavery was no longer legal in Massachusetts. It wasn't until, and I believe it was
1828 in New York.
1828 in New York.
It's amazing how long they had slavery in New York.
Yeah. And so what happened was the people in the community got together, and remember, this is 1808, way before there was lots and lots of Underground Railroad activity, anything like that. And they got together and started to collect money, and they collected enough money to offer Van Geyserling that money in exchange for Ginny's freedom. And they basically, the argument was, she'll just run away again if you take her back. And so he went for it, took it. To this day, that's one of the most cherished documents in Springfield history. It's still there. We've got it at the History Museum.
It basically began the anti-slavery movement in Springfield. Now, keep in mind, one of the reasons, well, how did Van Geyserling find out that she was in Springfield? Well, she and her husband, Jack Williams, had a place that essentially where Mason Square is now, a little bit further down on State Street, and it was one of the stops that travelers coming from the east could stop, and she was known for their birch beer that they would make. And people would stop for refreshments. She'd have pies, etc. And so you become known, oh, that's a place you stop, and so forth. And Geyserling said, wait a minute, she's mine. Oh, I'm sorry. So the community stood up to that. And from then on, it was very important. The first church in Springfield took an important role in anti-slavery. And at that time, that was Bezaleel Howard was the reverend at that time. Later on, he succeeded. We'll talk about Reverend Osgood, who continued that work and even expanded the first church's activity to stop slavery.
This slide up here is just to underscore the point of these are slaves in Washington who are being sent back to where they spend the night after working on both the Capitol and the White House. And now we get to a very famous point in this fight against slavery, and this is the Amistad. And this is
Prince
Cinque, who was a African prince who had been basically stolen and sold into slavery. The slaves on the boat decided to have an uprising, and they killed the captain and took over the boat. This took place off the shores between Connecticut and Long Island, and it ended up there ended up a trial in New Haven, I believe, was where the trial took place. The lawyer for the slaves and escaped slaves was John Quincy Adams, who did a fantastic job, and eventually they were set free, and the Springfield, there were newspaper articles all along when this trial was going on and stuff like that, and there was money collected in Springfield that was sent down to the people
for defense.
And so what they ended up doing is that some of the people that were on the Amistad actually came to Springfield to thank the people of Springfield.
This is something that you'd see in many papers surrounding Massachusetts, and certainly when slavery was happening in Massachusetts, it was in our paper. It was a common thing to talk about runaways and trying to get them back. Now, early on, Massachusetts did not have to return any runaways. So people could escape and come to Springfield and stay in Springfield.
And feel safe.
And feel safe. okay? In 1850, that changes. We'll talk about that. But until that time, it became, and so we began to develop a sizable population of African Americans some were from our area. Many started to come in from New York. That's where you get like Sojourner Truth, who people describe, she had almost a Dutch accent because she came from the parts of New York that were early Dutch settlements. That used to be a Dutch colony at one time. And so there's a little bit of accent there. You had people coming from the South. So it was a blending of African Americans from different parts of the colonies who were coming to Springfield. And then soon, of course, one of the connections early on was, again, the First Church. And here's Samuel Osgood, who was someone who was very open to, in fact, actually, he had a room that was hidden where he would hide escaped slaves if they needed a place to hide out. And also, he was also someone who was known to be open to mixed marriages, interracial marriages. In the First Church marriage records, you will see white and black New Englanders being married by this minister, which was unusual. In those early years. Yes?
What dates were you talking about?
Well, I mean, some as early as 1820s, 1830s. Again, it was fairly early. And later on, we started to see more Baptist churches providing that service. But for a congregational church, this was fairly early.
And the building that's there now, the church, that is the church.
That's the church.
Where this all happened. So if you want to get a sense of place sometime, you can go down there.
And it was the dominant church. It was the church. It was the leading church in Western Mass, really. And the minister of the First Church in Springfield did have a lot of influence over his colleagues and on some of these major issues. And so, his voice and his actions were very important. Also, he was very supportive and didn't feel competitive when the African American community finally got large enough to have its own church. And it was just down the street from First Church. And he was supportive of that. And while they were preparing their church, they could hold services there. But then in 1844, the Sanford Street Church, basically Sanford Street is underneath where the Civic Center is now. It's one of those streets right there.
Now by the 1830s, late 1820s, 1830s, and into the 40s, that was the height of the Underground Railroad. And actually, one of the interesting things is it also encompassed the time when the railroad itself was coming to Springfield. And interestingly enough, a lot of slaves actually, with phony papers, actually escaped on the railroad. Frederick Douglass had papers that said that he was a free man, and he got on the train and came up.
Yeah, it's a quick way to get it here. And whether you're as a passenger or stowaway in a freight car with the horses or hay or whatever it is that's coming up on the train, that's what happened. Now, it was at that time, first, yeah, go ahead.
First, what you see here, the railroad station was at grade level at that time, in exactly, where you see the train coming out there, today that would be where the arch is, so over Springfield. But next door is the most famous hotel in Springfield, and that was the Massasoit House. The two brothers who owned the Massasoit House were ardent abolitionists, and so they conducted their own hidden in plain sight form of taking care of escaped slaves, where they could eventually make their way up to Canada. And what they used to do is, by this time there was over 1,000 free blacks in Springfield, and so their wait staff was all African American. And so what they would do when a slave came through, they would give them a uniform, a waiter's uniform, and they would actually
Hiding
in plain sight. Now, at about this time, one of the people who came to stay at the Massasoit House, actually he was taking a trip to the Springfield Armory. This was a little bit before the Civil War, was the Secretary of War, who was Jefferson Davis. And there is a good chance that one of the escaped slaves actually waited on the table of Jefferson Davis when he was here.
Hopefully putting something special in the salad. But anyway, so it was also the time when John Brown, the famous abolitionist, came to Springfield. And when he came to Springfield, he didn't embed himself in the white community. He actually joined right in with the African American community. He was a parishioner at the African American Church, the Free Church on Sanford Street.
Which is on the right.
Which is on the right. It's the image of it. And his associates were really almost all African American. Thomas, famous local African American leader, is coming up. And this is John Mars, one of the early ministers of Sanford Street Church, and someone who we feel really inspired John Brown to take his anti-slavery feelings to the next level. I mean, John Brown talked about beating your plowshares into swords to defend your families. That it isn't simply we're going to defend our families with our lives, and he was serious about it, and John Brown took it very seriously. And with John Brown, then when he was a host to Frederick Douglass when he came to town. Here's John Brown's house. Okay, you want to?
Yeah. This is John Brown's house on Franklin Street in Springfield, and it was one of the, I consider it to be one of the most holy places in Springfield. But the urban renewal people in 1960s didn't, and it was torn down in the 1960s. My dad was a teacher across the street at Hooker School, and sent he and some of the kids that he was teaching at the time actually took some of the timbers from the house, and we brought them home and built a bar, actually. But it was, it was just, it goes to show you about that, that there wasn't really a lot thought about the kind of history that Springfield had.
Yeah, we didn't have enough Jim Boones out there to protect these buildings. If we could have brought you back in time, Jim, maybe we would have saved that building. This is Thomas's Union Restaurant, they call it Union Restaurant, and he's there in the window. Can you see to the right is Alexander Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois's grandfather, who was active in Springfield. He was a porter, but also was a leader in the community. And again, a little too old to serve in the Civil War, but was very active in recruiting African Americans to go fight for the Union cause. But Thomas was they call him lieutenant. Worked with John Brown in his wool business. And anybody imagine why he was in wool? Because wool was the freeman's textile, rather than cotton was the slave power's textile. So he was trying to, that was his business, wool business. He had a warehouse down by the railway, and he and Thomas would help hide escaped slaves in their warehouse. And in fact, in the History Museum, there's one piece of furniture where Thomas would be there to work on the ledgers, large ledgers, business ledgers. Underneath it, it's a huge container. You open the door, it's big enough for one or two people to be inside there, and the story is they would hide out folks in there if they needed to. So again, very early active. Frederick Douglass, this is the young Frederick Douglass. Usually we see the pictures of him with a gray hair, but this is the young Frederick Douglass when he came to Springfield to visit this significant African American community. And he spent an evening with John Brown, and he talked about, after he spent that evening with John Brown, he was convinced that there couldn't be a peaceful solution for the slavery issue.
It really changed the course of
Frederick Douglass's thought
and of history.
Yeah.
Because it led to Frederick Douglass was actually when John Brown went to Harper's Ferry when he went to Harper's Ferry, actually, he carried with him a constitution for the freed slaves that they were going to free when they got the weapons and guns from Harper's Ferry, which didn't work out all that well. But that constitution was actually written by Frederick Douglass.
So the connection between the two is very important. Now, it's very important. This happened just before they met in Springfield in 1849. About a little after that, John Brown left to go to live in another free African American community in New York. But when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, in which allowed Southern slave catchers to come into northern states and have federal law behind them to capture, to reclaim, quote, their property and bring them back to slavery, John Brown immediately came back to Springfield, assembled his friends, contacted Thomas Thomas. Thomas Thomas got all the prisoners together, all the men, to talk about creating the U.S. League of Gileadites. And essentially what that was, it was an illegal armed militia to say, we're not going to let this happen.
This is actually the
and there's the representation
artist
of
rendering
that meeting.
Yeah.
And they said that during, and we've had people like William Wells Brown, other African American leaders who came to Springfield during the 1850s, they said, whenever we came off the train, we were greeted by African Americans armed to the teeth who were there to make sure that no slave catchers came off that train into their city. And the authorities knew that was going on, never interfered with the Gileadites. And so they operated through the 1850s very illegally. Oh, by the way, now, and there's a double-edged sword with this, Eliphalet Trask, who was also an ardent abolitionist, was also the lieutenant governor of the Know Nothing Party. He didn't like Catholics and immigrants. But anyway, but he was a very powerful man in town too. His militia, he had a cavalry unit that was part of the state militia that he formed. Never had a problem with the armed African Americans. Didn't like Irishmen being armed. That was a whole other issue. Okay, yeah. Here's John Brown being caught. This is the iconic image. Want to tell him about that?
Well, yeah, this is John Brown actually being marched to his execution. There's an iconic image of him kissing an African-American baby that's being held up. And this is the execution of John Brown, which created a huge stir in the North and helped really solidify the direction that both sides were going to be going in. This is 1859, so 2 years later we were at war. Here's a picture of Sojourner Truth, and then the bronze statue that's in Northampton. And Joe, you want to fill us in on?
Well, Sojourner Truth, she's there's several stories with her. I mean, she came out of slavery in New York. Again, another individual. I talked about her accent. She carried the rest of her life. She became one of those individuals who was, of course, speaking against slavery from a personal experience, but also that it was a sort of a national sin. It wasn't just the South. This was something that the nation needed to deal with. But later on, by the way, she was a major spokesperson for women's rights as well. So again, the logic going from why slavery was a sin and freedom, that she made that intellectual connection that women needed to be offered a full range of rights as well. And so she was one of those early voices. But she came out from that experience of being a slave and being a woman. And she was very articulate. She continued her work till after the war, etc.
Now, this slide shows an older Frederick Douglass, and like Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass was day after day after day was on the trail lecturing against slavery. He came to Springfield many, many times, and every time his speeches were in the newspaper, and he changed an awful lot of people's minds. There's the story of his escape, which was the fugitive song.
It's William Wells Brown.
Another famous orator of the time who went from town to town.
A lot of his work happened in Buffalo, New York, but he was one of those connectors between what was happening in Massachusetts and what's happening in New York. Also, he became one of those individuals, you know, advocating for those Black Americans who had to go to Canada to get away from slavery as well. So he did a lot of work with those communities as well.
Now this is a story of Henry Box Brown, who was another. He wrote a book on his escape from slavery, and what he did was he had a friend pretty much nail him shut in a railroad express box, and they mailed him to Pennsylvania to a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, and they opened it up and out popped Henry Box Brown after over 2 days, I think.
Yeah, he was in there. They had him upside down for a while too.
And it was a little controversial because it was a spectacular escape, but he really kind of monetized the escape and literally went all over the northern part of the country giving lectures. And they would carry out the box and he would come out. This was part of his
show. Yeah.
He angered Frederick Douglass quite a bit because Douglass thought that this was a great way for people to escape. Don't let everybody in the world know about it.
Well, they increased the security on the freight from then on, so it's hard for other people to replicate his escape.
But he's another example of. I have to say, during this time period, there wasn't a month that went by in Springfield where there wasn't some anti-slavery talk or lecture from the most famous people in the world on this.
Now, at this time, it's important to mention, and this is a good slide to talk about. This is the James family, and they eventually became an important Springfield post-war period. Well, they came in 1863, but post-war family in Springfield at St. John's Congregational Church. All the daughters became big deals in the church. They married the Thorntons, etc. Anyway, they go on. But when they started, this is an example. There were two competing voices about what to do about the slavery issue. One was the Colonizationist Society, and they said, "Okay, we'll just ship you back. You know, okay, thanks a lot. Get back in the boat. We'll find places for you." And the other was anti-slavery, saying, "Hey, there shouldn't be slavery. They should just be Americans. Let's move forward." And these two groups competed in their area for advocates and for funding. The last effort, the last gasp of the colonization, they were losing out to the anti-slavery group in our area. But the colonization movement, one of the last ones, was just before the war. And just as the war broke out, in Haiti, which was one of the first free Black nations in the New World, freed by Toussaint Louverture and the revolution against the French. There was an opportunity to be a colony for these Americans who wanted to be in a Black, African-American-led community. So
on this little island.
This is Ile de Vache, and they went. The Jameses were among those who went. Eli Baptist, who became very important in Springfield because he survived this experiment and came back. He went too. He brought a wife and had a child. They died in that experience. The disease, the lack of food, it just wasn't planned out well. The person that started the colony basically either absconded with the money or blew it in some way. It's still a debate in historical literature, but it was really became destitute. And the James family, one of the James family, I think was it Lena?
Yeah.
Lena was born in Haiti. She survived, a little baby, and she was brought back. The way she was brought back is later on in the war, Henry Joseph James signed up to fight for the Union and was given a bounty, used that money to pay for his wife and kid to come back to Springfield. That's how they survived. So it's all woven into that story, but the colonization movement at that point died because at that point the war had broken out and it was time to confront slavery with arms. So here's...
Now this is a very famous drawing that ran in Harper's Weekly at the very beginning of the Civil War. And this is what's known as the slave stampede. And it was incredibly important because what happened at that point was that slaves by the thousands were heading behind the American lines, the northern lines, and the general that was actually running this area was a Massachusetts general, and that's him
on the left.
On the left, who actually came through Springfield when the war first began, and had over 1,000 people listen to his speech, and
his speech essentially was talking about defeating the slave power, even though at that point the nation was really talking about maintaining the United States. Even Lincoln was a little hesitant to be talking about destroying slavery as an institution. They had too many border states that had a sort of a skin in the game, as they say, in terms of still having.
Who he is.
What?
Who he is.
Ben Butler.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then to the right is Sam Bowles, and the editor and publisher of the Republican, who was an ardent anti-slavery person, supported politicians in the paper who were anti-slavery, was supportive of Lincoln, and again, throughout the war, became the Republican became a widely read newspaper, Union newspaper for the Union cause.
What happened with Butler is that he basically said that all of the escaped slaves would be treated as confiscated material or contraband. And that was basically saying if he were to let these people back, it would be a war crime to let them back because they were being used by the Southern troops to build forts and other things like that.
Just to show you that earlier picture real quick, that's the first North Carolina infantry. That's because it's North Carolina, it's not a Southern one. It was a Union regiment created. It was basically African Americans in it. The officer, the chaplain for that regiment was Reverend John Mars from Springfield. And the chaplain are considered officers. So he ended up being really the first U.S. African American officer in the Army.
This is a picture of the cabinet just before they issued the Emancipation Proclamation. That's a copy of the proclamation. This is one of the things that was also in Harper's Weekly.
We're not going to be able to get through all the rest of the slides right now because we want to leave some time for questions, and we know you have to get to class. But there's some slides like this, the draft riots in 1863, where basically riots, and they take it out. Who do they take it out on? African Americans. And so this is an orphanage. It was burned down. Why? You know.
It was a group of Western Massachusetts troops. It was a regiment from Western Massachusetts that was led by a man from Springfield. The
restored order at that point. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were there for what? How many months? It was
about 6 months.
6 months to make sure none of that happened. And of course, the Glory Regiment. Those people have seen the movie Glory. This is the 54th Mass. And it became a very, very important regiment. Another Sanford Street Church, our first church, St. John's Church minister, Reverend Samuel Harrison, was their chaplain. He's the one that fought for their rights to be paid. This
is the Battle of Fort Wagner, which is the movie Glory was based on, and it was several Springfield soldiers died at this battle, including one whose name was Rosalind Townsend, who in the before he was in the Army, he was noted as a Rosalind Townsend colored, and then the next time that they had a city directory out, he was Rosalind Townsend 54th, but by that time he was already dead.
So dead. The fellows, you see that group there. Company A was the company that led the attack. Company A had 40 guys in Company A were from Springfield area, African Americans. That's how many of our guys who were part of that. Many of them were killed or wounded. There also, keep in mind that many of these regiments were brigaded together. So, for example, the 36th, which Henry Joseph James from Springfield fought in the U.S. Colored Infantry, the 54th, which had Springfield folks, and the 55th all fought together in the Battle of Lusty in Florida. And here is the 55th, right?
Right, marching into Charleston after the fall.
Was that the first regiment marching in, right?
Marching
and it was a black regiment going into Charleston. Now, we're trying to make a point here. Yeah. We also had people from our area. What were women doing? There's a whole other story we could do on that. But we had a number of teachers who went to the South to help teach the newly freed African Americans to read and write. And these are pictures of two of the women that did that. We should probably transition to questions, I suppose. There's a whole other section. We bring the book that we have brings it right up to today's time. We spent a lot of time with Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow and the KKK and what that meant. And the reduction of, and then elimination of rights that were earned during the Civil War and during the amendments that followed the Civil War. We followed the Civil Rights Movement and the migration north.
This is a picture of Martin Luther King at Springfield College. When he actually, at the time, the FBI was trying to convince the president of Springfield College that he shouldn't allow him there. And the
college said, forget it, we're doing it anyway.
Right. And this is Ben Swan being dragged down the steps in the 1960s in a protest in Springfield to let people know that Springfield did take part in this movement.
And sometimes nice guys win. You see him, he wins the election. That's this picture when he first won the election, and he stayed as our representative for
This is one years. Of the big meetings downtown on Stern Square. And we don't want to, we can end with this because this is where pretty close to where the book ends.
Well, one of the co-authors, we wrote this together with Dr. Todd Robinson. His dad was a minister of this church, Bryant Robinson.
Which was torched on election night. This is
when Obama got
the election of Obama.
2008.
Obama on election night, and
2007.
It was rebuilt. It's beautiful now, and this is
Governor Patrick.
Governor Patrick and Bishop Robinson, and this is the last picture in the book, and it's basically the first inaugural ball with Obama and Michelle and Barack.
The nicest dressed First Lady we ever had. So we try to bring it right up to current time. So we hope you have a chance to spend a little more time with the book. But right now, we know we have a little bit more time here. We wanted to answer any questions you have, any thoughts.
Do you know whether any of the black Civil War soldiers are buried in the two Civil War sections in Springfield Cemetery?
Yeah, in Springfield Cemetery, there are African-American soldiers. In fact, in recent years, some of the descendants have applied for restored stones because they were usually these veteran stones were done of marble, and as you know, with the acid rain, they kind of melt. And so two of them have been restored by contemporary African-American citizens who wanted to make sure their ancestors were remembered properly. So, and my wife works at the Springfield Cemetery, so she worked with them to get the applications in. But anyway, yeah, there are a number of them that are not only that, but there are sailors, black sailors who were in there, as well as infantrymen, and a number that were fought in the 5th Mass Cav as well.
My question is extremely short. Will a copy of this book find its way to our library?
I hope so.
Those books, that book in particular.
Are you talking about the Stick Library? Yes, the STCC Library is fantastic about making sure that whoever appears here at STCC, we always get their books. So,
actually, the real answer to that is my wife was a student here when the book came out, and so we actually gave copies to the library.
Yeah.
Wonderful. That way we can all look at the pictures that we won't be able to see today.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Also, you know, we have a whole series that we're doing on the various ethnic groups of our very diverse community, and we've got a number of them out there. We did one on Latinos, Jewish, yes, and so forth. So we hope we get them all.
Wayne, I'd just like to review the year the Pequods were taken away and slaves brought back. What do you find that year to be?
It's 1637.
Okay, because if you check the records, there was the first African-American slaves were brought to Jamestown in Virginia in 1619.
Yeah.
Yeah. But these, I believe this was the first time that it was actually backed by the state, allowed to happen. And it was really the beginning of what they called the triangular trade.
Yeah. I think those were done by individuals who brought slaves to work their plantations in Jamestown, but I don't know. I mean, I have to look at that again. This particular thing, we were trying to make the point that when government starts to get involved and actually write statute to allow that to be a legal piece of commerce, approved commerce, right? And that starts to trigger lots of other things. Dr. Wisner, how are you?
Yeah, just to illustrate our present President Donald Trump, he gave a talk the other day, and he said, I want to thank Frederick Douglass for the great job that he is doing now. That shows his knowledge.
He needs to take one of your courses, Dr. Wisner. I mean, clearly, I'll tell you, thank you for, this is important. A number of us have taught history or whatever. It's so important that our kids learn American history, because otherwise, all of our kids have potential one day to be president. I want them to be a president who knows their history. And it's very important because it does inform public policy. It does inform, how we got to where we are and why we need to take actions to go further in a positive way. And American history is an important part.
One thing I would urge people today, if you get a chance to read Leonard Pitt's column, which is on the editorial page of today's paper, it's a terrific column. And Leonard Pitt's, at times, has always been kind of playing both sides of the fence. But his column is about what it's like to be a black man in America and how he's finally figured it out, that and it's all about, and what our book is all about, it's about this 3 steps forward, 2 steps back idea, which has been happening, and he's kind of pointing out that we're in the 2 steps back phase again. And each time there's some incremental gains, but a lot of times they get wiped out. One of the most horrible things about the Civil War is that 5 years after it happened, we're right back to almost a worse scenario than it was before the war.
We got time for one more question?
Okay, yes, sir.
John Brown, what years was he in Springfield? I'm curious why he attacked Harper's Ferry rather than this armory, and I assume it's age span.
He was in the reason he attacked the Harper's Ferry is because he wanted to be able to
give arms to slaves.
Give the arms to. They had envisioned that they were going to go up into the mountains and there was going to be a well-armed army. And he left here in the late 1840s. He was here for about 7 years.
Right.
And then went to Elba, New York.
Then came back briefly to help established the Gileadites and then took off again. Of course, went to Kansas. Again, back then, every state that came into the Union, there was this balance that they wanted to have. They're going to offer a free state and a slave state at the same time coming in. And Missouri and Kansas was free, and one was a slave state and one was free, and he wanted to make sure Kansas stayed free. And so, of course, the Civil War kind of really started in Kansas in terms of violence. If you have a chance to read some of that, we talk about that in the book a little bit, and the fact that some of the early anti-slavery families there, we were supplying them from folks out of Springfield with Smith & Wessons and whatever they could get to them.
And several of them were from Springfield.
And the ones from it was Wilbraham? Belchertown. What was the family? Dickinsons or no? I'm going to get
Robinson.
The Robinsons, yeah.
He became governor.
Yeah, he became governor. He was from our area, went out to Kansas and became a governor, and his perspective obviously was to keep that state free. So we have a lot of connections between Springfield. I guess the point we can leave you before you leave today, that between Springfield and our national history, it's not incidental, it's critical. They're key moments, key heroes that we can point to inspire us. And so, read about your local history. It does connect with the national story in a very important way.
And it's something to be very proud of,
yes.
The history here.
And if you have a chance, read the biography of Samuel Bowles, written by our Dr. Wisner, who we go way back. He did an awesome job on that and talks about those connections during that phase of Bowles' life, too. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Wayne Phaneuf and Joe Carvalho. Thank you very much.